All right, welcome everyone. So I'm going to be talking today about this thing we're calling continuous innovation. Before I get into that, I would like to set some context. So Justin did a great job of giving you the crash course of where we have been. I'm going to take a slightly different approach. As you can see from this slide, we have gone through many different ways of building products through the years. I want to set some context because I think that's important to understand where we are today and how we got here. So going back 100 years or so, we were going through the industrial era. This is where we were building all kinds of products, mass-producing razors and cars. After the war, a number of companies got pinched with resources, and Taiichi Ohno over in Toyota came up with lean thinking, what we now call lean manufacturing. Back at that time, efficiency was the name of the game. So it was all about producing the most number of products at the lowest cost, so profit or efficiency. Then as we moved into the digital era in the early 70s, we began to take some of the same techniques we used for building big products in factories and applied it to digital products. And that was the start of what we call waterfall. Building products was expensive, and so the unfair advantages came from good planning. Execution of the plan on time, on budget, was how we differentiated those companies that won from those that didn't win. This worked for a while, but as we moved into the PC era in the 1980s, requirements started to change very quickly, and it became increasingly important to start to build things faster. That led to iterative development, or what we eventually called agile. And this was what kind of started in the 90s and has still gone on till today. Many companies are practicing this. If you look at this slide, you will kind of see what's different about it. We're starting to add more iteration, and that was where the unfair advantages came from. Being able to manage changing requirements and adapt to them quickly. So that was the agile era, and that again worked very well for a while until we entered the internet age. And in the internet age, we have now been connected to customers at a pace and a speed that we have never been able to before. We can talk to customers, and that changed everything. The only way to actually build things that customers want today is to try to understand them, and the way to do that is to engage them continuously, which brings us back to lean again. So in the early 2009-2010 timeframe, a number of entrepreneurs, Eric and some others, got together and began seeing these patterns. And the point that I want to raise with all of these transitions is that we move from one way of doing things to the other, not because some thought leaders get together in a room and say it's time to change, but it's in reaction to the way customers demand products. Behaviors change, the world changes, and with it, new ways of building products change. And so Lean Startup entered the stage in 2010. We've been at it for a while. This is what that looks like. If you look at it, fundamentally, it's the same as waterfall, but you'll notice it's very compressed. So what's different today is the speed at which we're moving. So the speed at which we're building products is much, much faster than we have ever done before. Now, there is no right or wrong way. All of these are ways, as I said, in reaction to the way customers demand products. If we look at waterfall worked at a time when there wasn't a lot of competition, when companies could build big products, take all the time they needed to plan and execute that plan. If they got the product wrong, they could try again, because where would the customers go? Today, things have changed substantially, and the reason for that is that the cost of building products is at an all-time low. This has led to the global entrepreneurial renaissance that we are seeing. People all over the world are starting new projects. You may not know this number, but in 2018, just last year, there were 100 million startup ideas that started. Now, I want to be clear to point out that these weren't successful startups, but these were people who got together and started a company. That is 3 startups a second. So if I pause here for 3 seconds, we've got another startup that just popped up. That's a lot of startups. And so again, in the old world, when we got customer requirements wrong and build the wrong products, we got project failure. But with these many startups, when we continuously get the product wrong, we get total business model failure. And yes, this is my scary slide. So this is the disruption slide, and some of these statistics many of you know. The pace of disruption has been increasing. A lot of these logos that should be recognizable were all on top of their game until one day they weren't. On the other spectrum, the winners actually think differently. So the best way to find the next big idea is not through planning, but through continuous testing. So continuously testing your ideas. Now, in the early days of the lean startup, we would use startups case studies. So companies like Airbnb and Dropbox were just starting out. Today, they are some of the more valuable companies in the world. But this goes back even further than that. I would almost say the first lean startup examples were much, much earlier than these guys. They were companies like Amazon. So right from day one, Amazon had this notion of experiments. They measured their way of thinking in challenging their core business model. So the core business model when they started was selling books. They began to run a bunch of experiments, got into web services, got into TV, got into movies, and today some of those experiments are billion-dollar units in the company. Another company, to give you an example of the scale at which experimentation happens, is Facebook. You can see from this quote, there isn't just one version of Facebook running at any given point in time. There are about 10,000 experiments they're running. So this is Mark Zuckerberg telling himself and his team that he doesn't even know where the next big idea is going to come from. We need to search for that. We need to experiment and look for that. Now, these are some of the large-scale implementers of this idea of experimentation, continuous innovation, but there are many others. So a lot of these logos should also be quite recognizable, and they measure, again, their progress, their way of being innovative in terms of the number of experiments they run per year. So what's the common thread? So what's changed today? If we look at unfair advantages today, the new unfair advantage is speed of learning. If you can outlearn your competition, you win. And it's really as simple as that. That gets you to market faster, but you can't then slow down. You have to continuously outlearn your competition to stay relevant to your customers and to see your business model thrive and grow. I do want to point out, because I know some of these slides can be scary when we look at the speed at which Amazon and Facebook are running experiments, but I do want to point out that speed is relative. It's the old joke with the lion or the bear who's chasing two people, and one of them starts putting sneakers on, and the other says, "Why are you doing that? You know, there's no way you can outrun a bear." And he said, "I don't need to outrun the bear, I just need to outrun you." And that's the same thing that applies to all of you, is that your speed is relative. As long as you can outrun your competition, you stand to win. So I started out by saying that we have been talking about this for 10 years now. So in the room, everyone should be doing this, but that's not what we really see in practice. So what I really want to talk about today is what are some of the obstacles? Why aren't we there yet? What's preventing us from doing this? One of the reasons I find is that with all of these transitions, we don't get everyone switching at the same time. So in your companies, especially the bigger companies, you'll find that some of the early adopters of this kind of thinking might be some of the product teams, some of the development teams, design teams, but others kind of lag behind. And oftentimes the business folks lag behind because they still latch onto an execution mindset. The way to overcome this, especially when we start to go into the continuous innovation mindset, is we do have to start from the center in. So we have to not just copy a bunch of tactics, a bunch of skills and level up. You have to start internalizing certain key mindsets, which is what I want to really focus on today. So let's look at how this plays out, and let's see if this story is familiar to some of you. So you might have the next big idea in your company. You want to get the resources to get started, but then we are asked to write the 60-page business plan or 30-page business plan, the financial forecast, do an 18-month product roadmap. This, to me, is the number 2 killer of ideas. It's not the number 1. I'll talk about the number 1 a little bit later. This kills a lot of ideas, and the reason it does is not because innovators are lazy, they don't want to write these documents, but because when you're moving really fast, these things are simply unknowable. A lot of these things are just uncertain, and we can't document them. But let's say you want to get you want to get the funding, you want to get your project green-lighted, so you go through all this work, you do the Excel magic wizardry, create the spreadsheets, do the business plan. We then run into problem number 2, which is you now have the green light to go, but you don't really have traction to demonstrate. And we go back to the old way of doing things, which is the execution mindset. So we come up with other ways of measuring progress, like build velocity or execution of the plan. 9 months later, 1 year later, when you launch, you build something that maybe doesn't work so well, and that is in progress. Building something on time and on budget is no longer the measure of progress. So building something nobody wants on time and on budget just proves that nobody wanted the thing you built on time and on budget. So we want to kind of avoid that. The problem with these kind of heavyweight business planning approaches is that they take a lot of resources of the company. They tend to only allow the safe ideas to go through because the ones that are really truly innovative always sound crazy in the beginning. So they don't get past the gatekeepers, and we run into this problem here, which is we do a lot of more sustaining types of innovative thinking, not the more disruptive kind, which is what we really need to keep our business models alive from competition. So what I want to talk about is how do we get around this? So these processes, these heavyweight processes don't work. What can we do instead? So we're going to start by taking each of these and share some mindsets that can change some of those outcomes. So if you look at the heavyweight business plan, this doesn't work. I know a number of you may have written business plans before. I know a lot of you enjoy the process. I'm just kidding. It is a long process, and as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty that goes in writing these plans. What we have today is lighter weight tools, so lighter weight business planning tools. And the reason that those are important is because when you're going really fast and there's a lot of uncertainty, you need more dynamic models, not static plans. The business model, which is a one-page version of the business plan, has become a lot more popular. Maybe a number of you are familiar with the Lean Canvas tool. Hands, maybe how many of you are familiar with that? Or the business model Canvas. Those are all examples of a lighter way of getting an idea across. Now, I will point out that this does not mean that you have got everything figured out. This is really a snapshot of the idea, creating an initial snapshot of what might be a customer, what might be a problem you're solving, what might be a possible solution. We begin to communicate these very early on. It's a lot like playing with Lego blocks. We can use these Lego blocks to build some very quick models quickly. We can use the same fundamental building blocks to build more elaborate models. So this, by the way, is a life-size X-Wing fighter built not with giant Lego pieces, but with really small ones. And so the power of this kind of modeling is that we can quickly communicate an idea, and then we can start the next process here, which is the testing of that idea. So one of the key mindsets here is letting the team, not just the business team, but the product teams, internalize the business model as the product. That is fundamentally what we are building. And on the canvas, you'll find many building blocks that talk to every one of those challenges there. The next step in the process is identifying what's riskiest, not necessarily what's easiest in the plan, but what's riskiest. There's this myth in entrepreneurship that entrepreneurship is risk of, it's a very risky endeavor, but some of the best entrepreneurs I find are really risk averse. They're really all about removing the riskiest assumptions in their idea as quickly as possible, a lot like playing this game of Jenga. So we remove all the weak links, and then what we have left is a tower, an elegant tower that stays standing. This is the mindset of tackling the riskiest things first. When we look at risks, these 3 circles, which comes from design thinking, is a good framework to use. We can break risks into desirability, viability, feasibility. For a lot of innovators, they stress about feasibility. They stress about the solution they want to build. I call that the innovator's bias. Part of this is because we are in love with the solutions that we come up with, and so we think that's the riskiest thing to test. The other reason is that product development did used to be very hard. It's become easier. It's not simple. It's not easy, but it's easier than it has been before. So the top reason why we actually fail to build what customers want, in my opinion, is that we spend and waste needless time, money, and effort building something that nobody really wants. The reason this happens, again, is we prematurely go up this product pyramid, think we understand what customers want, spend a long time building out a solution that doesn't really resonate with our customers. The way to think about this is think of the solution that you start with as a key. We all can build keys. We can build nice-looking, beautiful keys like this one. The problem now is what door do we open with that key? That is the solution looking for a problem, or the invention looking for an innovation or a market problem. And it's a very hard one to solve. But if we simply switch mindsets, if we instead focus on the doors we want to open, focus on customers and problems before solutions, you can actually change the outcome of how you pursue innovation. So this is one of the key mindsets that I want to highlight here today, is starting with problems before solutions. We can look at this very logically on the canvas. If you are familiar with the canvas, there are these different boxes here. The customer and problem box are the pillars of the canvas. And the way we can kind of see that is if you get the customers and problems wrong, you might build a great solution, but if it doesn't really solve a customer problem, why would they buy it? So your revenue stream is out. You may have the best channels in the world, you may be able to get your product to customers, but again, if it doesn't solve a problem, why would they use it? You may have the best patents, the unfair advantage box there may be very solid and good, but that too will fall apart. So the whole business model comes crumbling down. So it kind of makes logically a lot of sense to start with these two boxes, but again, we find this to be a very simple idea, but simple doesn't necessarily mean easy. So this is one of the first principles, like we have first principles in science. One of the first principles to practice continuous innovation is to constantly challenge your assumptions about customers and problems. When you get a feature request from a customer, ask them what problem is it solving. When you get an idea from your team or from your stakeholders, ask them fundamentally what problem does it solve and for whom. Is it a problem that the company has, which is we are not making enough money, or is it a problem that the customers have? And if you side yourself with the customers, typically the money takes care of itself. We now move on to the next phase here. So we talked about starting with the model, identifying what's riskiest. This is, again, the scientific method applied to the entrepreneurial method. The last piece here is testing. So we have to test these assumptions. We have to test these risks rather quickly. This is where we look at the build, measure, learn loop of the lean startup. Again, some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. A key part of this loop is we are quickly putting things in front of customers, measuring their reactions to it. Based on the things we learn, we make course corrections or corrective actions along the way. Very important to end with empirical learning. So in God we trust, all others bring data. So data is a very important part here. Goes to the mindset of evidence-based decision making. So we all have opinions, and opinions are good. We all need strong opinions, but we have to hold those opinions weakly. And what I mean by that is we have to be the first ones to challenge them. Because we are trying to find something that works, it's more important to build the right thing through testing than to prove to yourself and your team that your opinion is right. So that's kind of another mindset which is more easily said than done, but a very critical one to internalize. So evidence-based decision making. We can now put all of these pieces together and start to paint the picture of what that entrepreneurial method looks like. So we are starting like a scientist with some models, making some predictions. We want to prioritize that model. So that's the next step here. So tackle the riskiest things, not the easiest things. For a lot of us, building product comes easy. The bigger question is asking ourselves, should we build this? Can we build this, and for whom we should build this? Finally, we get into the experiment phase, and then there's a feedback loop, which brings us back to updating our understanding of risks and then refining the model. The faster you can go from left to right, the more iterations you run, the higher your chances of uncovering something that actually works. If we take the second challenge, which is the communication of progress challenge, in the old world, in the factory era and even in the waterfall era, we used to measure progress in terms of output. How many lines of code are you writing? What is your build velocity? If you even practice lean startup, some people look at experiment velocity. How many experiments are you running? All of that is great, but what we need to really be doing is tying ourselves to actual business model outcomes. If we break it down, fundamentally, we makers want the same thing that the stakeholders in the room want, and that is traction or growth. No one in the room would probably disagree with this slide, is that when you see a hockey stick curve, especially when you're on the inflection point or on the right side of it, good things are happening. So traction matters above everything else. The challenge, of course, is that traction means different things to different people, and we need to agree on what it is that we measure as traction. A lot of people would say, well, let's measure revenue and profit. The problem with revenue and profit is twofold. One is revenue and profit is non-existent in new projects. It takes a while for you to get to that stage. The more important thing, though, is that revenue and profit are trailing indicators. They tell you that you have done some good things in the past, but if you don't know what those good things are, you can't repeat them in the future. And so that's why it's not as effective to really build a business or run a business based on how much revenue and profit you make. When revenue and profit are good, everyone takes credit for it. When revenue and profit are bad, everyone points fingers. And so it can be both ways. You can have it both ways. And so a much better metric to be tracking for traction are going to be some key customer engagement metrics. And again, if you dive into the body of work in Lean Startup and Pirate metrics in particular, you will see what some of those metrics are, but many of them are engagement-based metrics. Growth in any business comes from customer activity. If we measure the right kinds of customer activities, we can use them as leading indicators. If those things take care of themselves, if the right behaviors are happening, the revenue and profit will eventually take care of themselves. So traction is a measure of progress that we can use in lieu of revenue and profit, and it's something that we can do much, much sooner in the process. So these are the first 5 mindsets. I've got 2 more. Let's talk about this next one. So I talked about the hockey stick curve. A number of people love to be on the right side of it, and especially the big companies in the room. When you're at scale, we think all of our products should be at scale. You've got big customers, tier 1 customers, we should launch to them. Startups have the opposite problem, which is they don't really have the resources to go on the right side, so they have to progressively go from left to right, from the flat part to the other part. But the truth is that you can't really get to the right side of the curve without going through these other 2 phases. Now, you have a choice. You can either pretend and brute force your way to the right side, and we call that premature scaling. Many people get into trouble. They actually do some of the wrong things at the wrong time. To actually practice right action, right time, you have to internalize this next mindset, which is giving yourself permission to scale. And I say permission to scale because I know a number of you in the room have the resources to do a big public launch. The challenge, of course, is that when you are doing something new and innovative, even your customers are not going to understand it at first. And so you have to take a more systematic approach. And so this is where we can take the product life cycle, break it into 3 phases. We have the first phase we call problem solution fit. This is where you are going slow, and it's counterintuitive, but you have to go slow, you have to decelerate before you can accelerate. And so we are going slow. We are not trying to launch to our tier 1 customers, our best mainstream customers, but rather early adopters. We are trying to understand their problems and try to come up with some solutions. This is where we do a lot of that type of customer discovery work, customer interviewing work, to see that we have a problem worth solving. We then enter the second stage, which is when we start to build those early versions of product, things like the minimum viable product. We refine that and get it to a point where it's working at some small scale, and then we call that product market fit. And then finally, we get to the scale stage, which is where we all want to get to. And here, it's less about getting the product right, because the product should have been tested along the way. It's more about growth. So it's more about engines of growth. If you're in a big company, operationalizing it, going from a horizon 3 and 2 into a 1. Those are transitions which are not that easy to make, but that's the kind of work we are doing there. So giving yourself permission to scale is a key mindset to internalize. I want to bring this together by sharing a case study with you, which will talk about some of the things we have some of the mindsets we have covered. We'll also talk about this idea of permission to scale. I'm going to use an example that I know is very familiar to you here in Norway, because I know Norway is Tesla country. So let's talk about Elon Musk back in 2006. So when he took on the helm of Tesla, he had come from PayPal, come from the internet, so of course there were a lot of risks taking on a company like this one. But he had a big vision. He had a vision which he shared with the world, which was building an all-affordable electric car. Now, when he shared this vision with the world, he went around launching his product a very different way. Some of you, I know, probably know the story. But what I want to do is apply some of the mindsets we have covered so far. One of them is this idea of riskiest assumption. So we'll see if some of you in the audience want to throw out some answers. What do you think are some of the riskiest assumptions he was up against? What was he trying to test? Any thoughts? Don't be shy.
Electric car couldn't be sexy.
Would people like the electric car? So yeah, so for many reasons, he started with the sports car for that reason, to kind of break perception. But even so, I'll kind of move things along. So if we look at what were the risks, we can whiteboard this and we can fill an entire whiteboard with all kinds of risks. So he had never built a car before. There's a lot of risk in that. Would people like the car? All of those kinds of things. But the way we try to get to the riskiest assumption is we, again, don't worry about scaling risks. Those are important, but we don't need to worry about them now. What we want to do instead is worry about day one risks. So how would he get people to buy the first car? So imagine Elon Musk coming to you and saying, I built an electric car. You would say, well, that's very interesting. I care about the environment. I want that car. How far would it go? Right? That would be the next question you probably ask. And he says, well, given the battery technology today, we can probably build a car that will go 50 kilometers in one charge. And you might say, well, that's no good because my commute is longer than that, two ways. So maybe I can get to work and I can charge the car. How long would it take to charge? And then he would tell you it would take 8 hours or 6 hours to charge so you can get back home. And that's a no-brainer. So he wouldn't be able to make even the first sale. And that's how we test riskiest assumption. Don't worry about your 1,000th customer or your 1 millionth customer. Worry about customer number one and walk through what it would take them to buy your product. So when they went through that kind of thinking, they very quickly determined that the biggest risk in this business model, in this idea, was going to be the range of the car, what we called back then range anxiety. People were very concerned that the car would not go far enough because the battery technology wasn't there. Now, what was very different about Tesla is they realized that if they're going to be innovating on a battery, then why build an entire car? So their first car that they built is not actually a car they built themselves. This is a car they licensed from Lotus. This is the Tesla Roadster. They went and licensed this car, and why did they do that? Because they could go to market faster. So this is an example of speed of implementation. Compared to their closest competitors who were building cars, they went from concept to road drivable vehicle in about 10 years. Tesla did this in less than 3 years. It was something like 2.5 years. So they went from a concept to a car that you could buy and drive by taking this shortcut. We call this in the lean world the Wizard of Oz MVP. So we are cobbling together some existing solutions, taking some shortcuts. The important thing to point out here is that you don't just take what's off the shelf and give that to customers. You still have to put your secret sauce into it. That's your unique value proposition. So the MVP in this case is all about the UVP, which is a unique value proposition, which is an electric battery that Tesla built that can go 200 kilometers. So that's what they built. Once it was ready, they put it in this car and started selling that. So that was how they got started. Next question to kind of consider is why did they go with the Lotus? The Lotus is the opposite of what Elon Musk promised people. He said, I'm going to build you an all-affordable electric car. This is a $150,000, $200,000 car. It's the opposite of affordable. So why would they go with a really expensive sports car? This was something that Elon Musk had talked about in a blog post many years ago, back in 2007 timeframe. And he talked about his three-part strategy. And down below he says, don't tell anyone, but of course he blogged about it, so he was being a bit facetious there. But the point of this strategy was permission to scale. So he knew that if he had done a launch with a cheaper car, there probably would be a lot more demand, which means he would get even less sleep than he does today. They probably would have failed because when you get people, all kinds of people, buying a car that you're selling that could be a $30,000 car, they are going to be more mainstream customers. They're going to have different expectations. They're going to expect the car to just work because that's their primary vehicle. When it doesn't, they get very upset. They're going to expect charging infrastructure to be there. All of that could kill a company like Tesla, which was a startup back then. So by playing this game, by playing the hockey stick instead of letting the hockey stick play them, they were able to start with a really expensive sports car and only have their early adopter audience in mind. So these were people who had disposable income where they could spend this kind of money. Many of them put full down payments for the car with no delivery date in sight. They didn't know when Tesla would be ready. But 3 years later, this car shipped on their doorstep. They only made about 500 of them. They all came with a bow ribbon. When the car broke down, Tesla sent people to your home to fix it. So you got the high-touch concierge treatment. Now, this cannot scale, but this is a great way to start. This is a great way to learn from your early adopter customers. So what they were trying to do here is really test their riskiest assumption, which is, does our battery work? Will we put this in the car? Will it catch fire? Things like that. One of them did catch fire, but instead of getting a lawsuit, they got a bug report. It's like, this car luckily no one got hurt, so they gave the driver a new car, and they were a friendly customer, so everything was good. But that's how they got started. So they were able to test, refine, perfect the battery. Once they were ready, they moved to stage 2. So that's the product market fit stage. This is where they knew they had to build their own cars. So they stopped licensing cars from Lotus, began to they went and built a factory. They began to manufacture these cars, built it in such a way that they could update it on the fly. So that's how they did the continuous delivery of features of the car. But this is stage 2. So this is still not all affordable. It's a mid-volume, so less expensive, but still expensive car. Less high price, but a mid-volume production car. While they were doing this, they were again buying themselves time to build the infrastructure, charging infrastructure, all of the other infrastructure for selling cars, servicing cars, and then eventually they launched the Model 3. The Model 3 was the vision, but it took them 10 years to get there, and this is a great example of permission to scale. They could have done this a lot sooner. They could have put the battery into a Ford Mustang or a Volkswagen and gotten the car out a lot sooner, but then they would have had to deal with a lot of scaling risk challenges. So this is kind of the lesson that I wanted to share with you, is that even a company like Tesla doesn't start at the scale stage. They are trying to have a big vision, and they're being patient to kind of manage the risks along the way. Let's take the third challenge here that I shared with you earlier. So when we can only execute a few big ideas, the danger here is you're going to only invest in the safe ideas. So how do we overcome that? This is where we have to start thinking differently. We have to start taking many small bets. Not all of those bets are going to work. So even if you look at Amazon, for every one of those success stories like Amazon Web Services or what they're doing with TV now, they've had many others that have just not done so well. But Jeff Bezos has a very healthy way of looking at it. He talks about how I'm shooting for home runs, and the good thing is that in business, if you hit a home run, which is a US analogy, it's not just a 4-point home run, you can get a 4 billion point home run. So you have to be shooting for the fences. So you have to keep your core business intact, but shoot for the fences on many other things. So make many small bets, make many crazy bets along the way. The way you do this is by building an idea funnel. So if we look at the traditional way we have done innovation, we take a bunch of ideas, we try to find the best ones, we do heavyweight planning. The traditional funnel is broken because only the safe ideas get through. So this is where there are just too many ideas. If you do a crowdsourcing of ideas in your company, you can generate a lot of ideas, but then the gatekeepers would only allow the safest ones through, and then because there are no clear metrics, we run into all the problems that I talked about. So just the safest ones get the funding, and that doesn't lead to the kind of big ideas we're talking about. If we take some of the principles we talked about, the new funnel looks something like this. So the stages are different. We have stages for the problem, solution fit, product market fit, and scale. And instead of looking at execution velocity, we start looking at business model evolution. So we come up with a bunch of ideas, put them on a canvas of your choice, be able to tell that story and see how that story evolves. Unlike a business plan, which is very hard to change because the impression that you give with a business plan is I've got it all figured out, I need to just execute this plan. Changing a business plan is a sign of weakness. Changing a business model is not. That is learning. And so that's kind of a key way or a key mindset that's different here. So the evolution of the business plan is really what this communicates. If we layer on traction, we can now measure the output of a business plan. So we don't have revenue and profit now, but if we can measure engagement. So even when Elon Musk was launching his ideas, when he was sharing the Roadster, even before sales happened, he could measure all kinds of engagement from the audience. He could measure people hitting the website, people putting their email addresses, wanting to know more about the car. All that is good. If none of that had happened, why even build a car? If you can't generate interest and demand for a product before you launch, why even launch the product? So this is where we can use the measure of traction, those leading indicators, to be able to see how the business is working before revenue and profit, and then when revenue and profit comes, you can shift to that. Now, once we bring the traction metric, we can begin to identify stages. So we can talk about when is it time to move from the ideation phase to the incubation phase to the product market fit phase, because you need metrics to do that. That's one thing we see a lot of teams struggle with, is they start, but they don't know how to move from one stage to the other. What are the necessary metrics to use? And so once you can build a traction model, you can begin to identify those stages more clearly. Now, very important to also have this mindset of the earlier stages being less about funding the right ideas and more about building the right teams and thinking processes. So it is about mindset. So if you remember my 3 circles, it is about starting with mindset and moving out. And so when we are looking at ideas, there are going to be a lot of crazy ideas. And if you, as a stakeholder, try to only fund the ideas you understand, you're going to miss out on the ones that could potentially work, because a lot of the ideas that do work over time always start out sounding very crazy in the beginning. So the best investment against that is investing in the people that you have. If you invest in the right people and teams and internalize these mindsets, they will find evidence that will find the good ideas from the bad ones. And that's the challenge of innovation, is that in the early days, all ideas look the same, the good and the bad. But if you can apply some of these techniques, what we are trying to do is do a sorting process. We want to find very quickly which ideas have potential that we carry on to these other stages, and the ones that don't, we just silently forget about them. And that's not failure, and that is actually a sign of progress. It's time not spent on the wrong idea. In companies like Google, which is now the branch of Google, which is Alphabet, they actually reward people for killing ideas. You may have heard this. They reward people. They do a lot of moonshot projects. One of them was the hot air balloon project, which was about internet over hot air balloon. They were working on that for a number of years. One day, an engineer walks into the office, goes on the whiteboard, spends 30 minutes proving to everyone in the room that this idea could never work. Everyone agreed, and they killed the project. And that person didn't get fired, he actually got a bonus. So if you can go there and invalidate an idea, that's actually, again, progress. And it requires kind of different thinking to look at it that way, but it is, it is a time not spent on the wrong idea. So finally, in summary, I'm going to share with you what's different about startups and big companies. And fundamentally, if we look at it in theory, every large company should win. You've got all the resources you need, you have access to customers. In theory, you should never fail against startups, but we see startups sometimes running around, running circles around big companies and launching faster. And here's the reason why. So if you look at startup failure, startups usually fail because they fail to find enough customers. They don't have those resources, they don't have the channels, they don't have access to customers, and that's the reason why they die. They can't find enough customers to talk to. But many big companies die because they stop talking to their own customers. Or they build the silos, which by the time the people doing the work get the requirements, it has morphed so much that what we build is not really what the customer really wanted in the first place. And there are some fixes to this. So really, if you internalize this mindset, there are things you can do. You can make it easier for anyone in the company to talk to customers. Cross-functional teams, a lot of tactics that one can use, cross-functional teams, easier legal processes for certain customers, customer advisory groups. There are many techniques that one can use to remove some of these silos, but that's what gives you that competitive edge, or allows you to take advantage more fully of your competitive edge. This stuff is going to be uncomfortable. Every transition we have made, whether it's from waterfall to agile and now agile to lean, is going to be a little bit uncomfortable. Things are going to be different, but that's just the nature of what these transitions look like. This is early stage of agile, so I remember I had a very comfortable office. One day my manager pulled me out of that and put me in a war room like this one. I thought I was being punished. I'm like, why am I in a room like this? I like my plants and I like my computer back there. But this was not punishment, it was not micromanagement, it was just early days of agile. Today we take this stuff for granted. This is the new normal. So the new normal is you showing up to work maybe at 9 o'clock, and at 10 o'clock, you leaving work to go talk to a customer, or getting on the phone to go talk to a customer. And it may not look like work because you'd rather be more productive writing lines of code or designing things or putting Post-it notes on walls, but that is a different type of work. And that is not what we measure as learning in this new way of working. So I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'm going to be around, so find me in the next break, and I'll answer any questions that you have. Thank you, everyone.